David Marples is a distinguished university professor of Russian and East European history at the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta. And Professor Marples joins me once again from Edmonton to discuss his perspective on the most recent conflict between Russia and Ukraine. David, welcome back to Bridge City News. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so David, last time we spoke, I asked you how long you thought this conflict between Russia and Ukraine would last, and you indicated that it could go on for quite a while. And well, here it is, a year later, and they're still at it. David, do you see this conflict waning anytime soon, or is this something that could continue to go on for several more years?
I'm not sure about years, but it certainly could go on for many months. And both sides are gearing up for new offensives, particularly the Russian side, but both sides actually. And I can see over the next weeks more escalation, particularly in the Donbass and perhaps in the south as well, and maybe even a thrust or two in the north towards the major cities of Kharkiv and Kiev on the part of the Russians. They've indicated this, and I've seen, for example, the president of Chechnya has also advocated that Russia must take cities like Kharkiv and Odessa if he wants to win this war, and it's a tough task, and it's not something that they're likely to achieve, I think. But nevertheless, that's the ambition that they have right now.
Yeah, would this be this Russian surge that we're hearing about towards the latter part of February?
Yeah, I mean, they're prepared, it seems, to lose a lot of troops in order to make advances. And I read in one report that they're losing perhaps 800 soldiers per day so far in this month, which is more than at any time during the war previously. And it's also more troops are being deployed than ever before as well. Having said that, Russia's not yet on a full war footing. It still calls this a special operation, and it's called up another 300,000 or so troops, which is much more than it had initially at the start of the war, when it started with about 130,000 troops. But it's by no means all the Russian army. They've not done a full call up of all the people who would be eligible to be called up if necessary.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we have Western countries and NATO countries that have now promised tanks and different type of artillery. So do you think that this would help Ukraine at all, or is it going to be too late?
It's a good question. I mean, it depends really how quickly Ukrainian technicians and troops can be trained in order to use this equipment. And right now, you have Ukrainian soldiers being trained in this country, in Canada, in Germany, in the United States, in the UK, just to use the weapons that they've been allocated. So this may be a factor, in fact, in Russia's thinking, that they want to have a major offensive before these weapons come into play and make as much progress as possible before that situation may turn with the new weapons, because some of them may be quite decisive, I think, in stopping a Russian offensive or promoting a Ukrainian offensive with the use of, say, the tanks that they're being given from Germany and other countries, United States as well.
How much longer do you see before there could be a Ukrainian capitulation to Russia?
I don't think Ukraine will capitulate to Russia. I think Ukraine will keep fighting as long as it can keep fighting. And that may be for a long, long time. I think Ukraine has the numbers and the support it's getting from the Western countries would be enough to keep the Ukrainians in the field for many years, actually. Russia could make let's say Russia could likely to take the whole of the Donbass. That is a possibility. In other words, they could capture the city of Bakhmut, which they laid under siege last September. They're still trying to occupy it fully. And they could move on a major city such as Slavyansk in the west, which used to be, in 2014, the capital of the separatist forces when the war first started. And that is a target for them, to capture all of those two regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Luhansk, they've already taken all of it, but Donetsk, there's certain holdouts of cities as well. But I think Ukraine could do a counterattack, say towards Melitopol, further to the south, that would break the Russian connections with Crimea, and that would put Russia in a very vulnerable position in the south. So there are a number of developments that could take place. It's hard to know exactly what both sides are thinking.
So, from your background as a historian, can you maybe explain why this conflict, why does it matter so much to Vladimir Putin and the Russian nation, this particular conflict right now?
Well, Russia, and particularly Putin, subscribes to a historical narrative that sees Kiev as a founding state of the Russian state of Muscovy. That the Kievan state in the 10th century that adopted Christianity in 988 was actually the founding principality of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, that the three East Slavic nations arose from that, and that history afterwards is always based on that interpretation that the three states are actually one people, one culture, and one religion, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church. So Putin and others have never really accepted that Ukraine could be independent from Russia. They see Ukraine as a part of Russia. If you like, as a little brother, they were known as the little brother during the Soviet period. And Little Russians is another word that the Russian state has used for Ukraine as well. So I think for Putin, it's a kind of blind spot. He cannot accept the idea that Ukraine is a sovereign state with its independence and wishes to go towards the West, wishes to move to the European Union, join NATO now. Quite clearly, Ukrainians want to join NATO now, and therefore has tried to stop it in every way possible. But in the way he's done it is, in fact, served to unify Ukraine as never before, and all the regional divides that we've seen over the past 30 years seem to have evaporated, and now Ukrainians are quite intent on removing Russians from their territory and keeping their own state intact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We're hearing also about Transnistria and Moldova. So, do you think that these territories will reconnect with Russia after this conflict is completed?
Moldova is a sensitive region, and Transnistria has existed now for 30 years as an independent state that's really recognized by very few states of the world, but has its own government. And the government there kind of looks back to the Soviet period as its ideal. I mean, it has almost a Soviet flag, it uses Soviet symbols. They never really seem to have moved on from that. But nevertheless, they broke away from Moldova, and there's no real opportunity for Moldova to retake it. So I think the rest of Moldova at the moment, I don't think is on the immediate horizon of Russia as long as this war in Ukraine continues. I would say probably more vulnerable are the two breakaway states of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which broke away in 2008 with Russian support, and which Georgia has basically lost control over. They're not fully independent yet, and they're not attached to Russia at the moment, but they could be. And this is the sort of place that they might look if they wanted to expand further. But I don't see these regions as important as Ukraine and Belarus. And with Belarus, you probably know, the Russian army has about 15,000 troops there now, which is more than they had at the start of the war last year. And the question is, why? Why would they need so many troops up there? And where is this going? What are they going to do? And there was some speculation that the Belarusian army would also join in the war. But so far, that's not happened. And I don't think it will happen because the leadership of Belarus, which came in, which retained power in 2020 despite mass protests, that leadership realizes that the Belarusian population does not want to join in the war in Ukraine. So in all these areas, there's a lot of tension now. And even in the NATO countries like the Baltic states, they're very concerned about what Russia might do.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's been a little bit of rhetoric about the globalist aligned governments wanting to weaken Russia and then move on to China in 2024. Do you feel that the European nations can maintain this push along with the U.S. to continue to see Ukraine as a proxy in this war against Russia?
Well, I mean, I think the United States is not fully committed to to doing anything more than push the Russians out of Ukraine. I mean, it's not attempting to threaten Russia in any way, and it's not using, let's say, planes and other weapons that could actually bomb Russian cities. There's no thought of that. There's no real intention to build up this into a major world war. But on the other side of Russia, China has been backing Russia so far. But at the same time, you see some reticence on the part of the Chinese as to how long this war can keep going and how long they should support Russia if the war turns out to be a very long one. Because China's a trading nation and it cannot really commit itself long term to a major war in the center of Europe, which is basically where Ukraine is. There may be a possibility, in my view, of some kind of agreement or rapprochement between the United States and China. I mean, obviously, now with the balloons being shot down and Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year, they didn't help at all. But they've not entirely stopped discussions between Washington and Beijing. And I see them as possibly continuing. Because if China could at least be neutral, then the Russian regime that's in power now would lose a huge base of support and a recipient for its oil and gas now that the Europeans have basically cut off oil and intend to cut off gas supplies as well. So I think that would be really my strategy if I was a president of the United States. I think that is where I would look to China, not as an enemy, but as some country that could actually be brought on board, at least in the short term, to put pressure on Russia. Because otherwise, if Putin has Beijing behind him, he could continue indefinitely.
Mm-hmm. From your perspective as a historian, how do you see this conflict playing out?
It's very hard to say because much depends on the will of the Western powers to keep supporting Ukraine and how long it can continue. I mean, for example, in 2024, there'll be a new presidential election in the United States. And should, for example, a Republican take over, be it Trump or someone with the same sort of views as Trump, the United States support for Ukraine might diminish. I mean, it might stop altogether. Trump has never given any support to Ukraine, and I don't think he would if he came back into power. If the Democrats get another term, Biden stands again and gets another term, for example, then I think the United States would still commit itself to the war. Britain would join in. Most of the European Union would as well. But even in the European Union, there's some sort of dissent. I mean, the Italian foreign minister was in Minsk today for discussions, even though Belarus is supposed to be cut off from all contact with the European Union. And the question is, will he now go to Moscow and start talking to Putin as well? I don't know. But both Italy and Hungary have sort of formed some kind of dissension within the European Union on the unified policy towards Russia's war in Ukraine. And that's a dangerous sign. So I think everything has to stay in place, and there has to be strong commitment in order to keep Ukraine's military fighting in the longer term.
Yeah. It looks like we are out of time, but David Marples, professor of Russian and East European history at the University of Alberta, thanks so much for joining me today and sharing your knowledge and expertise.
Yes, my pleasure.